Hi, this is Paul. I want to weigh in a little bit on I think what it is actually an important mile marker in the history of the Jordan Peterson phenomena. And there's a lot to see here, and there's a lot of people getting excited about some things, including some of the parties involved. And I don't think it's needed to get excited, but just to sort of understand what the first wave of the Jordan Peterson phenomena was and why we're no longer in it and what that means for many of the parties that have taken part in this over the last 5 years. So Sunday morning, I woke up and I usually brush off the sermon before preaching, take a look at comments in the rough draft, this kind of thing. And very quickly, Bethel McGrew had sent me this Twitter storm by an Alexandros Marinos is in Crete, who was complaining about what David Fuller had written about whatever happened to Jordan Peterson. Whatever happened to Jordan Peterson? Nothing. He's the same guy he ever was. Peterson was always railing about compelled speech and totalitarianism. He still is. He was right then and he's right now. Fuller didn't get it then and he doesn't get it now. Okay. That was his complaint. And he's complaining about, I think, a pretty significant piece that David Fuller had written, Whatever Happened to Jordan Peterson, a turning point for his audience. Now, right there, lest we talk past each other, we should note that even though there's some overlap here, in many ways, Fuller continues to want to look at the Jordan Peterson phenomena and primarily and secondarily at Peterson. And Alexandros is looking at Peterson primarily and not so much addressing the phenomena. What I wrote quickly on Sunday morning, as I often do with my Substack, it's sort of a Twitter thread. I continue to see what kind of utility Twitter has, and I think it does have utility. I think it has to be used carefully. Jordan, of course, has had there's been a lot of drama around Jordan and Twitter recently. I don't know if I'll get into that in this video or not. But what I usually do with my Substack is I write a Twitter thread because sort of the shortness of each piece kind of helps discipline me to sort of keep something fairly concise. And I'll just read what I wrote so that I get it in. Marking the revival-like moment that was the Jordan Peterson phenomena. What happened to Jordan Peterson, to David Fuller, to me? A lot, but we're still the same people sitting in different spaces with different audiences. And right there, it sort of captures my point about I don't know how much Jordan Peterson has changed. He certainly changed some, but when I compare him now to before, I see a lot of contextual differences, and there's obviously a trajectory that Jordan has taken in terms of his career, his agenda, that I don't know I think is in keeping with who Jordan always was. Now, part of the difficulty in seeing each other and evaluating each other is all of our evaluations say at least as much about us as it does about who we are evaluating. And especially initially, there can be a lot of projection when you encounter someone for the first time, because so often we see and hear what we want to see and hear or what we need to see and hear rather than the person on the other end. This is very true of romantic relationships, and love is blind, the saying goes. Those first flowery days of infatuation, you're projecting like crazy on the other person, you're mirroring like crazy on the other person. What happens in long-term relationships is eventually the projections start to recede, the mirroring starts to recede, and you do the hard work of building a relationship with a person who might be very different than what you imagined them to be in the first place. Many relationships don't survive that. That's part of the reason people have relationships and engagements before they marry, to let some of that dynamic take its course. So the first, so I began with Alexandros Marinos's tweet, and then Rebel Wisdom's What Happened to Jordan Peterson. That piece, who changed, as with almost everything human, some things more than others. Some things changed, some things remained the same. There's clearly a core to Jordan Peterson that didn't change between 2015 and 2022. Look at Maps of Meaning. Yet other things changed dramatically. He went from a rock star University of Toronto professor to someone starring on Daily Wire Plus. Pretty big arc. We'll see what happens today at Daily Wire. What about David Fuller? In this same period, very much a seeker, first working in journalism, to the head of his own media company, pursuing the sorts of seeking that was clear from Rebel Wisdom. There's a good film, David likes to call them films, which Grimker always sort of teases about, that he has with his Rebel Wisdom campfire, talking about why terminate, what's next, and I might play some of that depending on how this video goes in this video, because it's vitally important to listen to if you want to understand Rebel Wisdom and David Fuller and Ali and everything that's going on there. And it says a lot about this interchange, which to me communicates how unfortunate a few of the Twitter interchanges that have passed, particularly the one between David and Michaela, has been. What should we pay attention to? Something happened from 2016, C16, Kathy Newman, beginning of 2018, etc., to 2019, illness that was significant. I think culturally and ecclesiastically transformative. There was a whoosh in Western culture that changes a lot. Tim Keller used to talk about, he picked this up from one of his professors at Gordon Conwell, that generally speaking, the church is sort of isolated in its silos. And one of the really good books about those different strengths is Richard Foster's Streams of Living Water. He writes about the contemplative tradition, the holiness tradition, the charismatic tradition, the social justice tradition, the evangelical tradition, the incarnational tradition. And those are all traditions within the church that have their own emphases that are often sort of in their own silos. And what Tim Keller's professor at Gordon Conwell noted, and Tim Keller picked this up and talked about this quite a bit, was that when revival happens, now how am I using that word? I'm not using it in terms of a camp meeting. I'm using it in terms of these episodes in church history when the church just seems to go on steroids. Sometimes revivals are geographically located. There was one in New York City in the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a major one in Korea. It's just the church just sort of I'll say it this way. The church enters a flow state. That's probably the way to say it. The church enters a flow state. And what Tim Keller and his Gordon Conwell professor noted was that all of the silos sort of break down, and it's like all of the things come online. Past videos I've talked about Voltron. You have like these 5 lions. And when all the lions come together and create Voltron, the sum is great. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, okay? And that's what happens. And I think between C16 and 2019, there was something like a revival that Jordan Peterson sort of initiated, participated in, was sort of the instigator of, was the front runner of, but there are obviously lots of other pieces to that. I mean, there was the man and the moment found each other, and there was a whoosh in the culture, okay? And then suddenly, lots of disparate people. And the timing, of course, for David Fuller was incredible because he was just leaving the BBC that he had been working for. And as he talks about in the various early films that he made, about Jordan Peterson, with Jordan Peterson. The timing, of course, in Jungian communities, they'll call that synchronicity. The timing was good. And so David Fuller comes online, and Roman Catholics find Jordan Peterson, and this Dutch Calvinist finds Jordan Peterson, and Jonathan Peugeot was already his friend, and Orthodoxy sort of. And so there was sort of this whoosh that happened in that period, and a whole lot of things changed. This sort of normal silo nature of reality sort of was diminished, and suddenly lots of people are talking to each other. Now, we can talk about that bounded within a particular time frame, but partly because of how culture and media and YouTube work, there continues to be little echoes of that revival that continues on. People keep finding Jordan Peterson and then go into the deep dive of watching all of his lectures and all of that material. All of the little clip channels and the clips that are out there, people find those clips and they hear a message. And so even though there was sort of the whoosh of that revival sort of thing, its echoes continue. But I mean, I was very much caught up in that. My channel got its launch in that. Rebel Wisdom got its launch in that. But one of the amazing things about that period was it went far beyond all of the little silos. And so suddenly Orthodox, Catholic, evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, some progressivist evangelicals, Dutch Calvinists. I mean, it was an event. It was a moment, and it happened. Now, for many of us who are sort of on the front edge of that, the moment has passed. Some people in that time changed positions. Other people are settling down into more stated positions. Why? You can't maintain a time like that. It's, John Vervaeke often talks about Kairos moments. It was a Kairos moment. You can't maintain that. And so what happens in church life is that there's this revival and then things settle down. And there are goods that happen, and bads, of course, that happen in both the whoosh moments and in the settling moments. You can't keep up the adrenaline Kairos moment forever. There has to be assessment. There has to be respite. There has to be settling in and getting to know your own little silos and your own little tribes. I think the best way to understand this current spat is that the groups are settling back into much more normal patterns of behavior, set chairs in the theater. And what that means is that now, instead of Jordan Peterson sort of transcending all of this stuff, now he's being seen in one of the silos instead of just sort of above it all, connecting with all these people. It's a natural process that happens with movements. Many of us are sort of sorting out, and many of us are still sorting out that. And Jordan Peterson, and to a smaller degree, David Fuller, were part of that. Jordan Peterson's illness, the pandemic, things have changed and in some ways settled down. Jordan Peterson has become something of a conservative public intellectual ensconced at Daily Wire. Will Daily Wire become something more than a media company that can't really appeal beyond its conservative base? I don't know. I found I didn't find. YouTube algorithm served up this. So Daily Wire Plus wants to become a media company that competes with something like Disney Plus and other major studios. It's an ambitious thing. A lot of Christians have tried this. So I found this review, which I thought was helpful.
So unless this species is getting dumber on an evolutionary level, and it truly is all downhill from here, I feel confident in assessing that the current age of cinema will be looked back on as one of, if not the absolute worst ever. This will be seen as that cringy era where touching on trendy themes and messaging was infinitely more important than the actual content of a story, but plot twist, all of the subtext is just the dumbest fucking opinions you've ever heard. A time when being subversive and going against established conventions for what makes a story good was standard practice. A time when strong women weren't allowed to actually behave like women, or even real people, and instead had to be super fucking annoying, toxic, and infallible caricatures of a brooding man. I think you could say it's my discontent with so much of what comes out of Hollywood today that led to me talking about Shut In and Rudd Hide Fight back in February. I'm not exactly a Shapiro superfan or a libtard destroyer myself, but I appreciated the kind of grounded, surprisingly apolitical films the Daily Wire is cranking out. And despite the fact that very few people saw that video, it still managed to rake in more dislikes and unsubscribes than anything else I've made. And because my default setting is self-destruction, I thought it would be funny to go for a repeat sometime. Much to my joy, I found out that the Daily Wire had been working on a Western, starring Gina Carano, the fighter lady, Cowboy Cerrone in his first acting performance, and Nick Searcy, who's probably not a household name, but he's definitely talented.
Anyway, so this guy's, it's very small channel, making the kinds of observations that, let's say, the critical drinker is about the culture, and noting, hey, you know what? Daily Wire's trying to do something. Word to Daily Wire, your apps need work. And you don't have a smart TV app, let's say on Android TV. So, and Sony's use Android TVs. So, you know, once you get an Android TV app, you know, I'll put it on my TV. I subscribe to Daily Wire, not because I'm politically aligned with them necessarily, but because I wanted to see the rest of the videos from Jordan Peterson. Now, I've talked a little bit about him going over to Daily Wire, and as he said it a couple of times, I mean, I understand it. Having lost his account on Twitter, or at least having it been suspended, and of course, and this is where Peterson hasn't changed. He's not a backing down kind of guy. I remember one of my early conversations with Ron Dart. We were talking about Erasmus and Luther and Peterson. I said Peterson is much more Luther than Erasmus. I mean, Martin Luther starts this little, you know, wants to get into this little conversation sort of at an academic level about indulgences and a variety of other things going on in the church in Germany. And he gets pushed back hard from the establishment. And what does Luther down? He digs in. I mean, Peterson with his Twitter thing, it's basically what he did when, for example, he got the letter from University of Toronto. You know, I won't back down. If I'm arrested, I'll have a hunger strike. I mean, that's who Peterson is. And that part of Peterson, depending, again, a lot of this is about context. That part of Peterson will sometimes look just stubborn and like an angry old man, but in other contexts, it will look genius, and the valence that the person has in looking at it will either make him look like an angry old man or an angry white man, or have him look like a hero. So that's sort of where context and valence and all of this stuff comes together. And so I was curious about, you know, the Daily Wire stuff. And so actually I thought this was a really good review, and I'll have to use Chromecast, their Daily Wire app, people, instead of just having it on my smart TV. And I paid for a year subscription, so you got a little time to satisfy this customer.
Brutal to the extent that I was a little caught off guard, because when I was thinking Western made by Daily Wire, I'm like, okay, it's a film brought to me by like 30 homeschooled Catholic guys and an adorable little Jew. This could very well be a pretty PG-13 hero story. Yeah, I let go of that notion pretty quickly.
So part of the point here is, again, that there's a lot going on here. And this isn't the Fish Radio, for those of you who are in North America, you know, safe for the whole family. Daily Wire is trying to do something a little different. So good on them. Now, will Daily Wire change Peterson? No, but how will the Daily Wire context shape Peterson? Because we are all shaped by our contexts. David Fuller will continue his seeking in the way we saw at Rebel Wisdom, but in a new way. And will that reach beyond its base? I don't know. And well, maybe I'll play some of the David Fuller video now here.
It's also, it's also an opportunity because so much of the community has really come together since COVID as well. That I think we only had like quite occasional meetings before COVID, and then the community developed. We launched the first course, and that was an incredible journey. We realized like the depth that you can go to through a sort of an 8-week course where you go on this journey together. And so this will be an opportunity for a lot of people, I think, to meet each other in person for maybe the first time. And so we very much want that to be a kind of pollination process, and people kind of being in contact with each other, coming up with ideas.
So now what you can hear here is that he wants Rebel Wisdom to end, and he wants that to pollinate out into something different. Now I got to find exactly what I was looking for.
So yeah, we've got the event to look forward to over the summer. As Ali said, there's sort of been a real release of creativity since the process of since really sort of dropping in and accepting, since sensing into the sense that okay, this narrative journey feels like it might be complete. And actually allowing that to land, for me personally, has been a huge process of unblocking what felt like a little bit of a sense of stuckness, which I was kind of feeling increasingly over the last year or so. Kind of that sense of editorial thrust that I felt at the beginning of Rebel Wisdom sort of just felt it all became a little bit more difficult, a little bit more of a struggle, and felt like it was sort of more of a push rather than a pull.
Now, of course, anybody who knows anything about Rebel Wisdom knows that they value the intuitive very highly. I'll say it that way. And so, well, I'll just let him keep talking, because he really goes through it quite clearly in this video.
Over the last year or so. And then since kind of feeling into, oh, well, maybe it's over, like there has been a huge release of creativity. I feel like tracking into where the conversation is at, especially with the Paul Kingsnorth, Mary Harrington piece, where it just felt like, okay, I'm kind of sensing into where the narrative is now and where maybe that kind of conversation is going again.
So again, this is how he started in 2017 with Jordan Peterson. He had that intuitive sense. He left his day job, off he went. And of course, I mean, part of that is what we do early is we tend to do a lot of projection. And so he saw a lot in Jordan Peterson, and there definitely was the whoosh that was happening. And then over time, didn't see some of the things that he wanted to see. Now, at least to this, I'm very interested in this new direction, in terms of Paul Kingsnorth and Mary Harrington, because I think that's a vital part of the conversation. But it's a changing gears.
And then over the summer, I'm really excited. I'm in Toronto at the moment, filming with John Vervaeke for the John Vervaeke documentary that's going to come out probably in September. That's hugely
and I'm sure when he was in Toronto and he did that talk with Vervaeke and Peugeot, and I'm sure he would have loved to have met with Peterson. Why it didn't happen, I have no idea, and I'm not going to speculate on it. Could have been that Jordan was gone. I mean, Jordan's got this insane schedule that he's doing now. Who knows why? But I really do hope that David and Jordan get a chance to talk face to face and talk through some of these things, and maybe they should actually have somebody else in the room, maybe John Vervaeke, to sort of help the process, because it's what you do. You
exciting. So most of the filming is going to happen at the end of July at a retreat that Rafe Kelly is organizing with John. So Rafe is this amazing parkour practitioner who was deeply into Jordan Peterson's work, then became really deeply into John Vervaeke's work. And he kind of takes the kind of conceptual and turns it into embodiment, turns it into practices, turns it into dialogos.
And again, I mean, anyone who is So in this little corner of the internet, we definitely have some little sub corners, okay? And this little corner with John Vervaeke and Rafe Kelly, those of you who've been around kind of have an understanding of what they're about there, and this is very much what they are. Now, Jordan didn't go in that direction really at all, and I think that became then a big disappointment for David, and I think he wrote a lot of this quite well in his piece. I'm a journalist and a filmmaker. I've made a dozen films of the BBC and Channel 4. It was the background I brought to my approach to the Jordan Peterson phenomena. When I discovered his work in mid-2017, I had an instinctive and overwhelming sense that he was headed for the big time. In many ways, I placed everything I had on this bet, and he did. Why? It seemed like exactly the right key for the particular lock at the moment. The excesses of postmodernity had been storing up a backlash of traditional values, and most important for me, I had seen how secular rationalist assumptions of the new atheist worldview had been narrowing, deadening influence on the culture, and there was a man who had fueled by deep appreciation of religion and mythology, the return of the archetypal and deep mythos of the culture. Now, David, like all of us, is a complex individual, and so when we look at sort of this big wave that went through the culture in terms of the end of the Cold War, the rise of new atheism, the change in alignment, Aaron Wren's language sort of gets at that, the change in alignment that comes through, many people participated in that big wave in different ways. And so someone like David Fuller could, part of him could see something from the new atheist, but he's also got this integral stuff that he's looking at. And the integral lens for Rebel Wisdom continues to be a fairly dominant paradigm in terms of how they're assessing the way things should go. In that sense, the integral frame is sort of a meta-narrative, and I don't want to push that too hard because they don't push it too hard, but it came up in the Zubin Damania conversation. It comes up fairly frequently that they're sort of their, if my sort of established paradigm is Dutch Calvinism, generally speaking, their sort of established paradigm is sort of an integral perspective on the world.
Turns it into practices, turns it into dialogos, and he's hosting John for a whole week at this amazing
Rafe Kelly
retreat place that his father's built out in the woods. So that's going to be an incredible visual feast of John's actually going to be teaching there as well. So we're going to have sort of John talking about the practices.
So again, if Robert Barron fans, Word on Fire people, they would imagine a Roman Catholic gathering. The Orthodox are going to do their own thing. The evangelicals are going to do their own thing. This is David Fuller's type thing.
Demonstrating the practices, going through the process. It's going to be a really amazing, it's developing into a really amazing film. And it's a kind of natural progression as well. And I think John's work is a deeper resolution of many of the same topics that Jordan Peterson and others were bringing up. There was something about the crisis of meaning, something about the need for philosophically engaging with first principles, this kind of sense of a kind of this sort of post-liberal moment of needing a new system and not really knowing what it looks like that John speaks to. And it's got to have religious elements. It's got to integrate spirituality and spiritual practice. And that sense of the journey that was started with Jordan Peterson and the Peterson phenomenon, I think is now John and others around that conversation are, for me, sort of the natural place where that goes.
Again, what I said before, wave one was sort of this revival-ish moment when there's just this whoosh, and suddenly people can talk across their silos. And now, some people in that time sort of moved between silos. Think about an estuary, think about a tidal pool. The tide comes up, the water's over all those little nooks. You can find these on the California coastline. And then the tide recedes, and then a lot of the little creatures are in their own little tidal pools, and they're not talking to one another. I think that's a good image here. They're not understanding one another, or they're all in their own little tidal pools.
you can kind of, yeah, there's a deeper resolution that incorporates spiritual practice. And the amazing thing about John, or one of the amazing things, is that he
and so in some ways David has moved on from Jordan and on to John, and there's a lot of people that have done that.
links together spirituality or religion and science without diminishing religion or spirituality. And that's kind of the why I think he's such a liminal figure. And so that's going to be a really exciting film. Will probably be coming out in September, I think. Then I'm also Daniel Schmachtenberger. I'm going to spend 3 days with him in June. I don't know what it's going to be about yet. He's just basically said, I've booked 3 days in the calendar. There's some things I've never shared with anyone, and I think we should sit down and make a piece. And the last time he said that was War on Sense Making. So I kind of trust him when he says he's got something of value worth sharing. I just say, yeah, okay, what time do you need me there, Daniel? So that is really exciting. That's going to be 3 days filming with him at the beginning of June.
Now, listening to this, you can note that there's a very big gap between this and, let's say, Jordan Peterson and Rod Dreher. Jordan Peterson and Rod Dreher are doing something very different than David Fuller wants to do with Daniel Schmachtenberger or even John Vervaeke. Now, there are obviously connections between here. I hope that Jordan and John continue their conversation, and I think Jordan continues to have a breadth to him. Now, unfortunately, and again, this is part of my concern with Daily Wire and what that will do. Now, it's very early days with Daily Wire, and the piece that had the Western gave me some hope that, as Jordan said, with this little press release that he put out, that he hopes to be able to sort of stretch or expand what Daily Wire, and it seems they want to do that. But the end of this conversation was the first, most of the YouTube stuff with Rod Dreher was pretty much culture anxiety, anti-woke. It was very much on topic, both in terms of what Jordan Peterson is talking about in terms of his anti-woke stuff. And Rod Dreher came to Sacramento, in his book tour. Rod Dreher's book tour is a little bit more like a regular book tour, and that he talks about the book. But Rod, anybody who's read Live Not by Lies, which was, I thought, a really good book, a really vital book, knows what they talk about during the YouTube part. After, you much more saw Jordan in this other mode of exploring religious topics, very much wanted to talk about Rod Dreher's own religious conversion, talked about a number of things, and that talked about the crisis of men, and Jordan talked about wanting to do something about that. But and that again, there's still crossover here with David Fuller.
The group might know about sense making dads. Who might that be, Grace? Yeah, so that's kind of a potential loose intention. And yeah, I'd love to hear any thoughts, Grace, maybe in the Q&A at the end. So I think we're going to be there in Austin. The conversation. Awesome. And the other piece for me is returning to the gender conversation. Like, I feel like that is something that I'm really drawn to. It feels like one of the main pressure points in the cultural conversation is a healthier conversation around gender. And it kind of ties into the men's work that we've been doing. And I feel like that articulating a healthy relationship, like, it still seems to me to be underneath a lot of the cultural dynamics, like this sort of there is a gender dimension to it. And I think it feels like it's time that conversation can be had in a healthier way. And so I'm personally really interested I've kind of playing with the idea of a men's festival at the beginning of October that will be a kind of cohering of the field of men's work in the UK. So I'm kind of inviting a few facilitators and wanting it to be a men's festival that is about kind of healthy masculinity, transformational culture, like how do we become better men? How do we kind of have a vision of masculinity that is not in any way oppositional or in any way kind of defined against the feminine, but is really about what is mature masculinity. Like my fundamental orientation is that what we need is not less masculinity, but more healthy, mature masculinity. And so that's sort of really something that I feel passionate about.
And again, I don't know that the language is very different. And for a lot over sort of on the traditional masculinity side, that might sound weak. Okay? That might sound squishy. All right? But I don't know that there's really that much difference between Jordan Peterson and Rod Dreher wanting to, really take on this men's thing. That's been a big piece of Jordan's, all of his conversations with William Farrell. So again, but what we see again is that the tide has receded and people are much more in their title pools. And it just in some ways, John Vervaeke just sort of fits a little bit more in David Fuller's title pool than Jordan Peterson does. So now David and Michaela got into it a little bit on Twitter. Michaela said, you could have asked to speak to him before writing a hit piece. A bit cowardly, if you ask me. He would have had a conversation with you, and I hope they still do. I didn't read David's piece as a hit piece at all. I saw it, well, David was pretty frank on David's assessment of Jordan. Okay, everything I said about assessments and evaluations still holds, that they have lots of us in them, and I don't think David would disagree with that. So I didn't really read David's piece as a hit piece. I thought that David raised some really difficult and critical points in it, that he had both appreciation and then he had a critique. And I really do hope that they do have a conversation. And I think they could have a good conversation. Yet, again, the times are different and the tide has gone out, and in a sense, they're in their own title pools. Now, David wants to do something a little bit bigger. Now, he's going to have his new YouTube channel is going to be under his own name rather than Rebel Wisdom. And I think part of that is, David himself retweeted the Jonathan Peugeot tweet where Jonathan Peugeot quite rightly said, you can't build anything on Rebel or Dark or these words. And David Fuller, I think, gets that completely, and that's part of the pivot. And he mentions early on that Rebel Wisdom continued to be a success. They continued to be financially viable, and I have an immense amount of respect for David for this. He's pivoting. I don't know how many of you saw on Netflix the Dave Chappelle speech that he gave at Duke Ellington School in Washington, D.C., where he went to school. Dave Chappelle's really been doing some pretty amazing things. And one of the points that he made was that he walked away from his success show for the sake of the art. And I think David Fuller is walking away from Rebel Wisdom in the same way. And if you listen to his community and in that video, they get it. And again, I have a lot of respect for that. But now again, the tide has receded and we're all a little bit more in our own little title pools. And so, and a lot of that transition happened with COVID. When I listen to people who, back in wave one of Jordan Peterson, where they were listening to Rebel Wisdom, well, they're always a little suspicious of, the way David's using language and the Jung stuff and the integral stuff and the men's work and the psychedelics and all of that spirituality. Well, once COVID hit, Dave went at that with the same kind of integrity. Now, again, integrity means consistency within. All right. It doesn't necessarily mean you agree with him, but the consistency within. And at least in the Alexander thing, it was, he mentioned again the some of the COVID stuff that people disagreed with. And there are others out there that have told me, oh, they really didn't like what happened with the kinds of things that David Fuller said with respect to COVID. People get to have opinions, disagree with their opinions, argue with them. But this sort of, you know, well, I'm not going to like David Fuller because he says things about COVID that I don't really like. I mean, it gets into this entire cultural junior high-ish thing where, in a sense, we're all dealing with these low-resolution reputational images of each other. And, you know, people believe what they believe. And I tend to, I appreciate when people, you know, I appreciate Doug Wilson. Why? Because at least he has integrity. It doesn't mean I agree with a bunch of stuff that he's saying or doing, but he has integrity in the sense that he's consistent. And David Fuller is consistent. I like David Fuller. I like David Fuller and Doug Wilson. Well, that's, you know, I'm very high in openness. This is part of who I am. And so I'm sort of a, you know, everybody's in their title pools, and I kind of like hopping between pools. That's kind of who I am. And so when the water came up, suddenly I saw all these new little pools I had never explored before. Then the water goes down, and I kind of slither between pools. So, well, let's take a dip in this pool. Let's take a dip in, you know, I subscribed both to Daily Wire Plus, and I continue to watch Rebel Wisdom, and I'll continue to talk to David Fuller, and I'll continue to watch what he puts out. I'm excited about the next thing that David Fuller is doing. I've got some cautions about the way it's going with Jordan, but I'm not giving up on him in that I think underneath a lot of what we're seeing with Jordan, I think he has, I hope that he still has the capacity to stretch Daily Wire beyond sort of a niche. Let them talk beyond their base. And I think, you know, Andrew Klavan, I haven't watched hardly any of Ben Shapiro. He seems like a very smart guy. But as Eric Weinstein said about him, he seems to want to play this thing on YouTube, which I just don't really have much patience for. Whether I'm agreeing with him or not agreeing with him, that shtick of just always appealing to the other creatures in your title pool, I find that a fairly boring game. I like to slither between them. I don't know if I'm a crab or a snake or a salamander, or I don't know what slithers between tidal pools. I know there's some smart marine biologist out there that'll give me a name. But anyway, so
but yeah, picking up on what Ali was saying about bringing these ideas to the mainstream, that's really where I feel called to go next, is sort of my own personal hero's journey, is sort of going from legacy media out into the kind of badlands of the alternative, finding these amazing ideas, these amazing figures. And then I really want to complete that narrative by going back to the legacy and shifting that. Like, for both of us, it's like, how do we shift the culture? How do we create an environment where people who would never think of doing personal growth work will do personal growth work? How do we kind of translate these ideas in a way that can potentially shift things on a more, like, for me, really, if it's not a cultural movement, then it's not sufficient. It's not enough. And in a way, the container of Rebel Wisdom and even the container of YouTube feels insufficient in some ways. Like, why shouldn't a series with Daniel Schmachtenberger be a Netflix series? Why shouldn't a series that I've been thinking about for a while with Aisha Akambi? Like, I've got a really clear vision for that, and I think Aisha is the right person to do a sort of deep dive into the culture war from a place of real empathy. And what I love about Aisha is that she is criticizing like extreme identity politics, but from a perspective of integration, from a perspective of empathy rather than reactivity. Why shouldn't that be a BBC series? I think it should potentially be a BBC series. I'm kind of in the medium term, I would love to set up a production company and start making pieces with kind of higher production values for legacy media or for whatever outlets will kind of potentially shift the conversation.
Higher production values. Now, again, there's a real parallel here between, I think, what Jordan is trying to do and what David is trying to do. They've both had success in what feels like the emergent market, and now they want to mainstream it. And so, in that sense, Jordan's move to Daily Wire Plus and David's desire to bring Daniel Schmachtenberger and John Vervaeke to Netflix and is, I think, part of the same thing. Now, they're moving in very different ways, but they're moving in ways, in some ways, consistent with their title pools. And so, again, to me, this is the best way to understand, let's say, the messy Jordan Peterson, David Fuller breakup on YouTube. Now, I do hope that these two can have a conversation. I think they're both very capable of having an excellent conversation. You know, it might be good to have a trusted third party, maybe John Vervaeke, speak with both of them, or to help them, you know, sort of make their peace, because this is the way it goes with working adults. And, you know, we have this in the church all the time. Two pastors no longer on the same page in terms of, let's say, where a church should go, or where a denomination should go, or where a classes should go. It's what happens with leaders. And I see both of them as evolving. But again, I think the times are different. The tide has receded. Now we're much more in separate title pools. And that's just a function of the times. So I made a longer, much more messy video yesterday that I decided not to post. And there may be aspects of that video that I can get into another video. I'm just about to leave on vacation. I don't know what'll be coming out in my channel during that. I'm going to the Canadian Rockies. Really looking forward to that. So, yeah, let me know what you think.